Our first presenters of the day will be Gillian Greaves and Dr. Christine Pelland. Gillian holds a master's degree in epidemiology and has been a valued member of the Southwest research team for over 6 years now. Christine is a veterinarian and a partner at Southwest, and she holds a master's degree in sow reproduction. I am very excited to hear from Gillian and Christine today. When Circovirus first became a relevant industry disease, I was too young to appreciate the impact. However, when I bring it up to my father, he still shudders remembering the problems that it caused in our barns. Going through school, Circovirus was a disease that we did learn about, but it was instructed to us almost as a non-issue. It was taught as a success story for vaccine impact, and it is. What is also true, and what has been very interesting as a new vet, is to see how this old, well-managed disease has begun to creep up, especially in the face of some nasty PRRS breaks. So, needless to say, I am excited to learn from this talk today. Please help me welcome up Christine and Jill as they talk to us about what is new with porcine circovirus.
All right, so I'm excited to chat with you guys today. I'm going to start with a bit of a review of a study that we've been working on for the past couple years, something that we were doing as a result of that study, and then obviously Christine's going to follow up after that. I'm excited to talk about circovirus, almost as excited as that sow there, but we'll go through, and if there's questions at the end, happy to go through that too. So the first thing I want to chat about is our circovirus study that we have been conducting since I think 2021. So it was a longitudinal study, goes for a couple years, and we've learned a fair bit from it. It's exciting for us to be able to share that today. So I didn't want to keep you guys in suspense for too long. So I'll talk about what we learned just off the hop here and then get into details. So the first thing that we learned is that PCV2 virus circulation is specific to each herd. The viral levels of PCV2 are dynamic over time. And specifically, we can't make clinical decisions based on a single PCR test result. Additionally, when we looked at the different phases of production, we saw that finishing had the largest variation in terms of CT values for PCV2. And then our main conclusion, key message from the study is that in flows without clinical PCVAD signs, so that's porcine circovirus associated disease, positive CT values from processing fluids or oral fluids weren't correlated with downstream production. So you might be wondering why we decided to do the study in the first place. And this graph here is just showing a trend of the number of submissions that we had from Southwest into AHL at Guelph. So we can see that over the period from 2016 up until the end of 2020, that submission number remained fairly static. So we didn't have an increase or a decrease, it kind of remained the same. But then at the end of 2020 into 2021, we saw an increase in the number of submissions. And the reason for that was due to some clinical impacts that we were seeing on farm, potentially some vaccine efficacy challenges. So it led us to ask some questions. So both producers and veterinarians asked whether we should monitor PCV2 CT values as an early indicator of herd instability. So within that question, we asked how do those values vary over time? And then secondly, how do those positive CT values correlate with clinical impact? So as any good researcher does, we started with a literature review before we began our protocol development. So we looked at the existing research that was out there to see what existed. So the first thing we looked at was using different sample types. So whether that be serum, oral fluids, processing fluids, or feces, and what the impact was when we pooled those samples together. We also looked at different phases of production. So not just whether to sample in sow, nursery, and finishing, but how many times should we sample and what timing made the most sense. We also looked at PCV2 dynamics over time. So looking at herds that were stable or unstable and what happened when we introduced things like co-challenges with disease like PRRS, for an example. We looked also at varying vaccination programs, so whether the animals were vaccinated in the nursery or in the sow or gilt populations. And with that literature review, we noted that there were few reports on CT values and their relationship with clinical and production outcomes. So that's something that we wanted to try and contribute to the literature too with the review, with the study that we did. So when we talk about our study design, we decided at the outset that we would follow approximately 25 flows with varying PCV2 historical diagnostics for 13 cohorts. At the beginning of the study, we would collect vaccination protocol, disease status information, as well as herd demographics. And we would start at the sow site. So each system would contribute 13 cohorts. In the sow barn, we would have 1 processing fluid per month per farm, and that would contribute 1 week worth of pooled fluids. We would follow those same animals, if we could, into the nursery, and we would again collect 13 groups worth of samples. We would collect an oral fluid in that barn at 2 weeks post-placement, and then again at 6 weeks. That would be 3 ropes pulled together, and then at the conclusion of those groups, we would also collect closeout data information. If possible, so there's a little asterisk there, we would also collect some finishing information. So from the sites that had a good flow and were easy to follow with those pigs, we would collect an oral fluid per barn. That would happen 2 weeks post-entry, and again be those same 3 ropes pulled together, and we would again collect closeout and death information too. This is just a visual for those of you who didn't like that first one of what that means. So we can see that we start with the cohort, and then the different colored blocks would be the different sampling points. And then you can see it's a rolling enrollment. So when we started cohort 1, 4 weeks later, we would then start with cohort 2. Another thing to note here is that we do our production data capture in that 4-week period and have the sampling in the middle there. So that's for the sow site information. So obviously, if we're talking about 13 cohorts, when you look at the timeline for a pig to go from birth to finishing, it's quite a long time. So we were asking a fair bit of our producers that participated, and we're really grateful that they were willing to help us out. When we talk about production data, we have the usual suspects in terms of information that we collected. So you can see there are some variables from breeding, farrowing, and lactation, and then again, in our nursery and finishing sites, we were mainly looking at mortality, but if we could collect average daily gain and feed conversion, we would do that as well. In terms of the farms that participated, we had a variation. We wanted the sample size to be representative of our industry. So we had multi-site integrated producers, we had multi-site family-owned producers, and then we also had farrow to finish sites, so where every animal is on the same location. Each of those had their own challenges and opportunities in terms of a longitudinal study like this. Obviously, it's easier to contact one person at a single barn than it is multi-sites, but it was an interesting learning opportunity for us to see how to make that happen. In terms of a timeline, we began with our protocol in the fall of 2021, and enrollment of farms started then as well. We chose to start with just a single herd at that point, make sure our process was good, and then carry on. So we began really enrolling in Ontario in the winter of 2022. In spring, we began enrolling in Quebec. So we have participation from a clinic that we are connected with called Triple B. And then in the summer of 2022, we began enrolling some herds in Western Canada with another partner clinic, Prairie Livestock Vets. So this is a very long timeline. It doesn't seem like that on the slide here, but we went from 2021 until the spring of 2024 when our last finishing cohort ended. So a fairly long time period here for sure. In terms of the flows that we enrolled, we had specific criteria. So the first thing is that we wanted them to be from across Canada, have various health statuses, and also varying vaccination programs for PCV2. And with that, also varying products. So there's a grouping here that you can see of the various vaccines, and there was at least one herd in our study from each of those companies. Another thing that we needed was electronic production records, so that was a necessity for us. And then the biggest thing from a producer standpoint is we were asking to collect samples for 18 months. So again, a big ask, and we're really appreciative. In terms of where our herds were located, we ended up enrolling 20 herds total. The majority of them came from Ontario from our clinic, was just 12 herds. We had 4 in Quebec, and then another 4 in Western Canada. Now, just before we get into the results and everything, we're going to talk about CT values, and I already have a fair bit, but just wanted to give a baseline for how to interpret those because it can be a little confusing. So when we're talking about PCRs, it's a method that we can use to detect disease for viruses like PCV2 and PRRS. A CT value that I've been talking about is a cycle threshold. So it's the number of cycles that the test needs in order to detect virus. So basically, all you need to know is that if you see a low CT value on a slide, it means that there's a high amount of virus. So low is bad and high is good. But I'll try and remind us as we go through as well. So an additional thing with our protocol is that we wanted to see whether we could use this surveillance monitoring in a way to try and detect problems. So one thing we decided partway through is that we would develop a clinical trigger. So if a herd met a specific criteria, we would then go and do some additional sampling to see what was going on if we saw a situation happening. So we determined that it would be a 5 CT point drop in the nursery period, and then we would do some further detection. I'm not going to go through all these specific details, but this is just an example of a herd where we saw in this specific cohort, they went from a CT of 40 to 28. They were, we're looking at the green line there. They stayed consistent in the cohort 5, and then in cohort 6, they had a smaller drop. So our criteria was that we wanted them to happen consecutively in order to do some more testing. And unfortunately for us, but not for the producers, we didn't have any herds meet that criteria with issues with BCVAD in order to do that testing. So it's a limitation of our study for sure. In terms of the herds that we enrolled, this is just the main demographics. Our herd size ranged between 400 and about 3,000 sows. The median there was about 1,500. In terms of the type of production, we can see some regional differences. So out west, we had 0% of our herds be farrow to finish, all were multi-site. And then in Ontario and Quebec, that kind of split a little bit more. When we looked at vaccination protocols, 100% of the herds enrolled were vaccinating gilts. All of them were also vaccinating nursery piglets, but we saw, again, some regional differences in terms of sow vaccination. So in Quebec, they're utilizing sow vaccines for PCV2 much more than we are in Ontario and out west. In terms of PRRS status, we again wanted that to be representative of our industry. And we can see that here, the picture has changed a little bit from 2021 until now. So at that point, it was fairly representative with those negative and stable statuses. And obviously that's changed a bit. So I'm going to go through the results here, and we're going to chunk them out into a few groups. So the first thing is just looking at all the CT values, and then we'll get into some more details. Before we get into those specific numbers, just wanted to go through response rate. So with a longitudinal study, obviously with 18 months of data collection, we expect that there'll become other priorities or producers may forget or will forget. So when we looked at that, we had a fairly good response rate for our study. So in the sow sites, we had 85% of our samples returned, 72% in nursery, and then about 56% in early finishing, which again, we considered those bonus, so fairly good. When we look at our CT values, this chart here is just showing the mean or the average that we received across the various phases of production. So as you can see, each of those dots would be a specific sample, and there's a fair bit of variation. So when you look at the processing, we're going below 25 all the way up to 40. And in this case, 40 means negative, but we need to give it a number in order to chart it. So as you can see too, though, it's variable in each of the different phases, but then also it trends down slightly as the pigs get older into the finishing phase. This chart here is just showing the different flows. So again, these would be mean values. There's a variation in terms of the number of cohorts that were submitted by each of these sites, but we can see system by system, there's a wide amount of variation in what those CT values are looking like for Circovirus. This is a neater chart because it shows each cohort individually for each of those herds. So again, when I talk about variation, this is what we mean. There's a ton of differences going on between those various herds. And something that's interesting to note too is that flow A as an example would be a multiplier herd. So very high health, very well maintained. And we can see that they have a CT below 20, but then a number of them were negative. So very much dependent on the system. There's no real trends that we could see even within the same herd sometimes, which was interesting. So now we want to talk about just positive CT values. So to make things a little easier, we took those 40s out to see if we saw a positive test, did that mean something happened downstream? So when we're talking about this, our sample size decreases a bit because we had about 30% in the sow and nursery come back as positive, the remainder were negative. And then in finishing again, we saw a larger proportion that were positive in those tests. So again, it's a similar graph to before, just without the mess at the top. So we can see again that there is still that variation, and that result still trends negatively as those pigs get older. This is just showing the same thing, but we wanted to block it out in a way that was a little bit more visual. So you can see the more positive samples, so that lower CT value, As they get older, we have a larger proportion of those samples get into that category, versus earlier in age, most of them are in that higher CT range, which means less virus is present. Looking regionally to see if there is any differences, the blue would be Ontario, the red is Quebec, and then the yellow is out west. And we can see that that trend continues no matter where you are in Canada. And obviously we have a smaller sample size in those provinces, so it's a little bit different, but it was good to see that consistency for sure. We also looked at seasonality to see whether there was any impacts. And this chart, the axis is only showing about 5 CT points difference, so we didn't see any trends with the season either. Another thing that we just wanted to point out too is that we had differences in terms of sow vaccinations. So all of the pink boxes would be herds that were doing a sow vaccine for PCV2, and that's something we're looking at in further investigation to see whether we can find any differences. So just looking at production outcomes, setting the stage, we just wanted to talk about the number of samples that were collected. So in total, we were able to collect information on 65,000 sows, piglets almost 1 million, and when we looked at nursery, about 400,000, and then in finishing, about 300,000 animals. So not a small number of pigs by any means. When we looked at those various production outcomes by province, we didn't see anything totally alarming or inconsistent with what we would have expected. So that's just kind of an overview of the different herds that we had. So getting into our main question, which is whether positive CT values were correlated with production parameters. Again, we had to limit that with our positive numbers, so it's that 30% or 50% in finishing. And this is the meat of our study. So when we look to see whether those CT values were correlated with production outcomes, they were not. So if you look at these graphs, a straight line means that there's no correlation, and we're pretty straight on all of those different ones. So you can see when we looked at percent of abortions, percent of mummies, nursery mortality and finishing, processing fluid CT values did not correlate with those downstream outcomes. Similarly, when we looked at early nursery CTs, we saw the same thing with those flat lines and no correlation between those CT values and mortality. So at the end of the day, our main lessons were that PCV2 virus circulation is specific to each herd. The the PCV2 viral levels are dynamic over time. We can't make clinical decisions based off of a single PCR test result. Finishing had the largest variation in terms of positive CT values. And then the final conclusion is that in flows without clinical PCV-AD signs, positive PCR-CT values from processing fluids or oral fluids were not correlated with production outcomes. So with that, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our participating producers. Again, 18 months of data collection is no small feat, and I know we really appreciated their support. As well for our partner clinics, so we worked with Triple B and Prairie Livestock, and they were great to help us out with the study, and then also to our pharmaceutical partners in this project. This was a neat opportunity for us because we had support from multiple pharmaceutical companies. It wasn't just one, so that's something that we were really fortunate to have, and it was cool to have that collaboration. Before Christine gets into her case study, we just wanted to go through our PCV2 surveillance. So obviously we went into a project with that longitudinal study that was a fairly big endeavor. And the question is, okay, what are we going to do about PCV2 moving forward? So we have defined a case definition in our clinic. So herds that are experiencing clinical signs of PCV-AD and have presence of lung lesions, if the veterinarian submits for PCR testing or IHC, it's flagged within our lab. Andriana is our case coordinator in our lab, and she flags these cases for us. And then we input them into a database after they're sequenced. So we had the opportunity with some funding to do some sequencing of cases that have happened in the past. So Andriana, again, had to go through all of our cases and see any that met the criteria, and we got those sequenced to see what type of PCV2 they had. So this graph is just showing 2019 at the bottom going to present, and the yellow bars are looking at PCV2D. So that's a specific type of PCV2 that we're seeing increased proportion of when we look at the samples that we're submitting for our clinic. And Christine's going to go into more detail with her experience as well. This is just to give an understanding of what we've got. When we look at the phases of production where we're doing that sequencing, the majority is happening in nursery and finisher. Obviously, we just had a single case that was sequenced with a piglet. And again, you can see that PCV2D is the majority of those as well. And then another thing too is we wanted to see whether there was an impact of PERS positivity on the cases that were sequenced. And we can see this top line here showing the number of sequences that were with PERS positive pigs at 90% versus negative, which is just something interesting to know. So in summary with that, we're seeing increase in sequencing for PCV2, specifically finding more PCV2D. We're historically seeing more issues in the nursery and finishing populations. The number of submissions with PERS positivity is also higher than without. This project's ongoing. As I said, Andriana's constantly looking for these cases. So I'm sure we'll be able to update you the next time we chat on what we've learned from that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christine.
Yeah, so Gillian sort of nicely introduced or led us into the case description that I'll go into here, but broad strokes is PCV2 as we once knew it is now changing, and we're catching up with our understanding. So we've identified from our PCV2 study that there's an emergence of Circovirus type 2D, and PCV2 in general, so Circovirus, has different genotypes, and it'll go A, B, C, D, and I think up to E. So we've predominantly worked with A's, or that's what our vaccines have been based on. Current circovirus vaccines, like I said, are PCV2A based, and we've always understood them to be have some cross protection to the other subtypes within the PCV2 family. In some scenarios, such as the PCV2D infection, in the face of co-infections, we're experiencing some signs, clinical signs of PCV2, which was referred to by Gillian as PCV2AD, so porcine circovirus associated disease. Recent cases had clinical presentations of this with the use of our current sort of true and tried vaccine programs. So I'll delve into the case and show you that there was no concern on vaccination protocol in the herd that I'm speaking of, and we still had some concerning presentations, which led us down a diagnostic route. And then in recent years, Jill sort of alluded to what we found internally from our study, but if you look into the literature, in the US, in Asia, and in European countries, the prevalence of PCV2 type D is significantly increasing in prevalence. So we're seeing that trend globally. So the case I'll take you through today, it's a 1,600 sow herd. Just a couple little details on the herd. They raise their gilts internally. So on the farrow to wean site, they've also got a branch of that will take their gilts on site through nursery, grower, and then back in as breeding animals. So just to give you context on the population, this flow would keep a proportion of those pigs, so they would go to off-site nursery and finishers dedicated to the flow, but then the sows were producing more than their current nursery and finisher can provide, and so this producer in particular was relying on buy-sell relationships that can sometimes be inconsistent, and I'll allude to why that might be important in this circumstance. We've got layered disease challenges and a difficult demographic. So an area by which there's lots of pigs around and we're getting hit with PERS and flu far more frequently than we ever have. So the clinical disease timeline for this particular case, if we look back to June 2021, they would have been living with what we refer to as a mild PERS with an RFLP of 111. This was being controlled to the best of our ability with the use of MLV vaccine, so PERS vaccine. Fast forward about a year and a half, we would have appreciated some clinical signs within the sow barn, so went in, did some testing, and uncovered a new strain to that herd, and that would have been classified more as a moderate impact PERS strain. and that was the RFLP was a 142. Again, with the demographic and the circumstance alluded to or went down the control route versus elimination at that time. Fast forward 1 full year, called in for a vet visit again. The pigs were struggling, post-wean, coughing, thumping. It was more dramatic this time. We did some diagnostics and uncovered PRRS virus was still there. Sequenced it out. It was 142. It was homologous to that previous November 142. So we refer to this as a flare-up of their background field strain. In addition to that, uncovered H3N2, which was the nasty new flu virus, the Pennsylvania strain. So again, delved into, are we solid on our PRRS control methods within the herd, looked at retained gilts, growing pigs, tapped into the monovalent H3N2 vaccine when it became available late, so just probably around that time in 2023. Would have expected a natural improvement clinical signs associated with those viruses. So PRRS or flu, if you get a new break, a new strain, we expect probably a lot of damage in that first 2-3 months, maybe stretch out into 4, but we should see a natural improvement leading into that 4th month, regardless of your intervention. So in March, November, we had the flare-up, we had flu. March, again, we're expecting there should be some light at the end of this tunnel. And we're into the first quarter of this next year. The nursery and early grower areas in the south site were appreciating 20 to 30% fallout. It was massive. Lots of variation in size, thumping, coughing, razorbacks, a variation in scour. So I'm going, oh my goodness, what the hang. Now, I allude to the buy-sell agreement. So at this point in time, there was some inconsistency on being able to sell their weaned pig out the door. So they had to retain a lot of those growing pigs, which puts pressure on the herd overall. So I go in and I'm going, shoot, this is just a roadblock. Like, we're keeping too many growing pigs under this roof in areas that we don't typically keep them in, and that's adding pressure, and maybe that's what's giving us our poor results all of a sudden. Went through postmortem a whole bunch of pigs in the nursery because it was pretty dramatic walking through there. Varying degrees of pneumonia, some enlarged lymph nodes. The youngest pigs were sort of scouring and just a whole plethora of different signs. Hannah mentioned it. So I was on, I would have been in school when the vaccine came out for Circovirus. So I didn't really appreciate clinically what this looked like in herds, but I've heard a lot about it. And I'm walking through and I'm going, something's not right here. Like, it doesn't feel like it's just PRRS or just flu, and we should be out of the thick of things there. So validated a couple of things, and pigs were consistently and accurately being vaccinated with a full dose of Circovirus at weaning. Their gilts were consistently and accurately receiving full dose of Circovirus pre-breed. And so that was solid. And I'm still getting a funny feeling that something's not right. So I take you back a little bit to where Jill defined a case definition of Circovirus. And this is within our practice, but it's also well known within the swine veterinary community as well. So we can't obviously rely on just CT values from our PCRs, as we've acknowledged from our study. There's a few things that have to line up in order for us to say, yeah, what we're seeing is really due to this Circovirus. So clinical signs, weight loss, scour, respiratory issues, high mortality rate, especially in younger pigs, and enlarged lymph nodes. That's our PCV-AD in a nutshell. With that, we also have to have PCR positive results. So we do have to have virus that we're finding in tissue, and in particular in the lungs. That's typically where we'll further sequence from. histological changes suggestive of PCV2. So when we take those samples, put them in the little jar and send them off to the lab, the pathologist will take a look at all those different tissues under the microscope and say, there's damage here. What does it look like it's most associated with regards to the different diseases that we deal with in pigs? So the pathologist sort of has a flag for potential PCV2. And then we get into the IHC, so immunohistochemistry, and to distill that down into stain that they put on the tissues that they look at under the microscope. And if the stain is taken up by anything, it's got a predilection for the particular virus that you're looking for. So it's telling us we have that specific circovirus in the lesions that we're looking at under the microscope. But only then can we say that we've got circovirus as a problem. So when I went in March, I sampled a whole bunch of pigs at varying ages in the nursery, found PRRS, not a surprise. CT ranges we have on here, but I'm not going to lean too heavily into that because they can vary at this point in time after a break. I've got PCV2 PCR from the lungs, positive. But when we did the IHC panel, it was only showing up PRRS. It looked like flu wasn't being a huge contributor and PCV2 came up negative. So I'm going, okay, it still doesn't feel right though. However, there were some things that we put in place to try to mitigate the risk, but we continued to have frustration and lack of response. So if it doesn't make sense, go look again. So in April, not that long after, a couple weeks after, post-mortemed a number of other pigs, and the farm's still struggling significantly. Like, this is 20% mortality in the nursery. It's just unrealistic to carry on with. At this point in time, I had my radar vision on for any pigs that I was concerned about circovirus. So we got the trifecta on the test plus the histology on this one. So PCR positive, IHC PRRS, and PCV2 histology. And so we met case definition for PCV2. So then we further sequenced it based on the information that we learned from our internal study. And lo and behold, we had this type D. Unfortunately, we don't have a vaccine in our toolbox right now that can necessarily help us in this moment with that. So, because of the clinical picture, the diagnostics to this point in the circumstance, frustration really sank in, right? We did everything we could given the tools we had, but we didn't have access at this point in time to the defense vaccine, which I'll give you a little bit more context to. So we were leaning into our PCV2 type A based vaccines. We blitz vaccinated all the suckling pig, nursery pig inventory, and boosted a full dose, or boosted all that inventory with a second full dose. So they were already seeing it at weaning. Maybe giving them another boost in their immunity would help. It was sort of a last ditch resort. We switched suckling pigs to a full dose split into two. So instead of giving one full dose at weaning, we took one full dose, split it. They got half that dose at processing, half at weaning. And then we also blitzed the sow base with a full dose. So things started to look a little bit better. We thought, okay, maybe we've boosted the immunity, small improvements in pig quality. This was before we had the defense vaccine in our back pocket here. Some fallbacks, but they were getting a little bit reduced, but we still needed lots of interventions to keep these pigs going. So middle of June, we were able to bring in a defense vaccine, which is a circovirus type D vaccine. It became available, or it is available in the US, but not in Canada quite yet. And we brought it in on an emergency release because we were having a concern here. First pigs weaned received defense middle of June, and to give some context to that, it was a smooth transition. So the vaccine works very well. Wouldn't have appreciated any differences from giving any other circovirus vaccines. This is some of the results. I'm gonna take this with a grain of salt. So this is a farm case report, not a case controlled. The pre-vaccine values are not tidy, but they were conceptually what the fallout was over a big chunk of time prior to the vaccine use. So we have significant losses and the significant amount of treatment required to keep what pigs did live alive. So up to that 25%. And then after the vaccine, we have two options here. One, we followed the pigs that remained on the sow barn site, and then we followed pigs that were sent to an off-site nursery. So we saw improvements in both mortality and treatment rates. However, we were also seeing improvements before we gave the vaccine. So that's why I'm not making a direct link between defense and improved performance, because we could have had a more controlled PRRS virus and influenza virus happening about the same time. But this is promising to see that we at least were moving consistently in the right direction. So my take-home messages: it's not clear that the dramatic improvements that you're seeing and are not still where we need them to be, if they were due to improved PRRS and flu control, or whether the vaccine really has a huge impact. It wasn't a light switch. It's just a continued improvement. We're out of the vaccine that we brought in, and we're waiting for that vaccine to be available in Canada, probably end of this year, hopefully for sure by next year. If I were to run into this situation again, I would be far more thorough potentially with my gut reaction on this isn't following a natural timeline with PRRS or flu, and dig in a little bit further for concerns with maybe PCV2. If the case definition is present, don't hesitate, sequence right away. We want to know what genotype we're dealing with. If PCV2 is identified, we need to have this vaccine in our toolbox, because we've intervened far quicker than we were able to in this circumstance. And then it's still question marks. We want to lean into our US colleagues or information globally on how they're using a PCV type 2D vaccine in the face of clinical concerns. Do we just target our growing pigs? Do we look at the sows in conjunction with that? So we need to understand that a little bit more. And then in the thick of a new PRRS break or flare up, be mindful that other diseases can become issues even when they haven't been previously, or we think we're solid on our vaccine strategy. And that's my case discussion.
Thank you so much, Christine and Gillian, for that really interesting circovirus update. Gives us lots to think about. So now I'll open the floor up to some questions. So feel free to raise your hand up, and I'll have Hannah run the microphone around.
The farm that you're doing the study on, were they doing biofeedback?
Yes, to varying degrees. Yep. Yes.
What's the
Yes, I believe they were using manure feedback. But it wasn't souped up.
Christy, in your case, did the farm continue to use their traditional circovirus vaccine in addition to the defense, or did they stop with the previous vaccine and just use defense?
Yeah, good question, Greg. So the defense vaccine, to the best of my knowledge, has cross protection to all the other strains. So we simply swapped it out. And it is part of the flex dynamic. I think I can say that. So, it was easily mixed with Mycoflex and could be with the PRRS MLB if needed. So it was a one-to-one swap. And we're not concerned about lack of coverage for any of the other genotypes.
So, with putting you on the spot a little bit, but was there any difference in the CTs or the clinical presentations with different vaccine companies or different programs of single dose, multiple dose, or anything like that?
No, I mean, Jill can elaborate on that, but the bottom line from the study is that there is no consistency, regardless of vaccine, regardless of stage of sampling, there's slight trends for where it might be higher versus lower in CT value, but there was no appreciable or significant difference between products, doses, timing of doses, sow vaccination, all of that. Which is why we needed the replicates to justify it, right?
So then I guess, is this new? Or is the technology just allowing us to get smarter and find more things?
Is what new?
The D.
D is new. I think there's a change in Circovirus that we're now appreciating and starting to look for more. So the technology to sequence has always been there. We've just never needed to lean into that because we've had good control. It's the lack of potential overall control that has pushed us to look deeper, and we're seeing a trend in a shift to type D, is my understanding.
Thank you.